Hey everyone. As I am certain you have all already heard by now, Johnny Depp has lost his libel case against NGN in the UK. So the purpose of this video will be an attempt to explain and analyze the judgment. And I stress the word attempt because as far as judgments go, this one is quite devoid of any judicial reasoning per se, and is rife with assumptions and inferences that have been made based sometimes solely on Amber's testimony. So this is the way the video is going to be structured. I'm not going to be going into each and every paragraph of the judgment in detail. It is a very lengthy judgment. I couldn't tell how many pages it is because I've read the HTML version, but I have read somewhere that it is over 100 pages. So instead, as per usual on my channel, I have taken the liberty to read the entire thing and then summarize it and talk about key areas or highlights in the judgment. And of course, at the end, I will be offering my personal opinion as well. The judgment begins with a recap of the burden of proof and the standard of proof and the defense that has been relied on by NGN. We've already talked about this in quite some detail in a previous video, so I will breeze through it. The defense of truth is a statutory defense in the UK and is found in Section 2 of the Defamation Act 2013. What must be proven is substantial truth, so not absolute truth. As long as the gist or the sting of the article is substantially true, then the defense has been satisfied. The burden of proving serious harm rests on Johnny. It then shifts onto the defendants, NGN, to prove the defense of truth. The standard of proof in civil cases is on the balance of probabilities, which is not a very high standard. Essentially, the judge must have been at least 51% convinced that Johnny has met his burden of proof, which is that he has suffered serious harm, and that the defense of substantial truth has been satisfied. As I'm sure you will all remember, Winona Ryder and Vanessa Paradis have both submitted statements in support of Johnny and his character. Unfortunately, again, if you'll remember, they were not called upon to testify during the trial. As such, Johnny was unable to rely on their evidence as per Rule 32.51 of the civil procedure rules. Essentially, that rule states that if Johnny wanted Winona and Vanessa's statements to be relied upon, he must have called upon them to give oral evidence unless the court orders otherwise or the statements are included in as hearsay evidence. As I said, Johnny did not call Winona and Vanessa to testify, and I do believe, if I remember correctly, that it was because of time constraints. And then, as the judge pointed out, it would have been open to the defendants to put in Vanessa and Winona's statements as hearsay evidence, but that was not something that NGN wished to do. And it makes sense why they refused to do that, because the statements were essentially in favor of Johnny. And so NGN did not want them to be considered at all by the judge, which is exactly what ended up happening to Johnny's detriment. It is unfortunate, and we're seeing the result play out before us right now. But as they say, hindsight is 20/20. Johnny's team probably thought, as most of us did, that his evidence was strong enough to win the case without Winona and Vanessa's evidence. On the topic of SAVANNAH McMillan, very briefly, this is the friend slash not assistant who was with Amber in the US, and Amber drafted a letter to immigration essentially stating that she was here as her friend on a personal basis and not on a business one. The judge essentially believed Amber's evidence and ruled that this letter to the US Department of Immigration did not in any way impinge on her credibility. With regards to Amber's charges, to which she pleaded guilty in connection to the illegal importation of her dogs into Australia, the judge found that that proceeding was so far removed from this proceeding that its relevance for her credibility is marginal at most. With regards to the more serious allegations of forcing Kevin Murphy and trying to force Kate James to lie for her at the Australian court proceedings, the judge found that there was no evidence that Kate James was actually asked to make a false statement. He also accepted Amber's account that she was only willing to accept responsibility for the offense because if Johnny was convicted, that might prejudice his future ability to travel to Australia, which would have been a problem for any future films that were going to be filmed in that jurisdiction. In support of his finding, the judge cited the fact that it was Johnny's lawyer, Marty Singer, who took care of the case, and he also further relied on Johnny's involvement in the apology video. With regards to Kevin Murphy, the judge rejected the notion that Amber pressured him to make a false statement for her. He accepted that the purpose of Amber traveling to Australia was essentially for Johnny's benefit. He also accepted evidence that she believed that whatever difficulties there might have been with regards to taking care of the dogs have been overcome. He took Amber for her word when she said that Johnny's staff made things happen for him. Whatever Johnny wants, Johnny gets. The judge further attacked Mr. Murphy's credibility as a witness because he was prepared to give false evidence in connection with the Australian proceedings. So in a nutshell, because Kevin was willing to lie in the Australian proceedings, then he's not a credible witness in the eyes of the judge. He also found that Mr. Murphy was an enthusiastic supporter of Mr. Depp, which is a recurring theme with regards to Johnny's employees, as we will find out throughout the course of analyzing this judgment. And so finally, he decided that all of these allegations against Amber with regards to pressuring Mr. Murphy to lie for her are unfounded and do not impinge on her credibility. With regards to the infamous Grease the Vet comment, which, by the way, I do want to clarify, was not made in connection to the 2015 dog smuggling incident. It was actually made in September 2013 when traveling to an entirely different destination. Amber said that Grease is Johnny's language, not hers, and the judge decided to take her word and believe her testimony as it was made under oath, which again was a recurring theme throughout this judgment, and I will be making comments about that in due course. After securing the TRO against Johnny in 2016, Amber did not refrain from attempting to contact him, and eventually she even ended up meeting Johnny at a hotel in July of 2016. Now, I do want to say that over here in Australia, when you have a restraining order against someone, the terms of the restraining order are very clear. They clearly state that even if the victim attempts to contact you and reaches out to you and tries to tell you that it's okay to talk to them, you must not engage. If you engage, you are in breach of the restraining order. You can face jail time and serious fines. So I'm just trying to bring attention to the gravity of what she's done. With regards to this incident, the judge found that it does not assist him in deciding whether Amber is to be believed with regards to her allegations. He stated that victims can have mixed feelings about their abusers. That does not negate the fact that the abuse actually occurred. And purely from a legal standpoint, purely from experience, I do have to say that I understand the reasoning he arrived at, specifically with regards to this point. It really isn't all that uncommon for victims of abuse to have mixed feelings towards their abuser. A lot of the times they're still in love with them. They are very confused about whether they want to be around them or not. So this in itself, seen in isolation, is not a good indicator of whether someone is lying about being abused or not. Having said that, with regards to Amber and Johnny, when you put it all in the grand scheme of things, it's just one piece of a very large puzzle. In my opinion, it contributes to her lack of credibility. All right, this is the part where I started to laugh in disbelief as I read it. We all know the infamous audio recordings. In fact, these audio recordings are the reason why a lot of us who initially may have believed Amber including myself, by the way, finally heard the truth and learned who the real victim is. In my opinion, they were the strongest piece of evidence that proved that Amber was in fact the perpetrator and not Johnny. Now, I do want to point out that this is a defamation case or a libel case, and the sole purpose of these proceedings is to decide whether Johnny is actually a wife beater or not whether Amber abused him. But of course, her abuse is very relevant to, firstly, her credibility. If she's lying and saying that she didn't abuse him and then it turns out that she did, that makes her out to be a liar. But secondly, it's also important for Johnny to claim self-defense if he ever did lay a finger on her. So the argument would be, yeah, I may have shoved her or pushed her away from me or whatever it is, but I did that in self-defense because she was physically assaulting me. So that's really the relevance of her abuse in these proceedings, because these are not criminal proceedings regarding who assaulted who. This is a defamation case at the end of the day. So these recordings were played out. The judge is aware of them. And this is what he had to say. And I really do want to read this out verbatim to convey how ludicrous this paragraph and this reasoning is. In my view, no great weight is to be put on these alleged admissions by Ms. Heard to aggressive, violent behavior. These conversations are quite different to evidence in court. A witness giving evidence in court does so under an oath or affirmation to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. None of these features applied to these conversations, which, in any event, according to Ms. Heard, had a purpose or purposes different from simply conveying truthful information. And this last part of the paragraph was in reference to Amber saying she was being sarcastic when she said, "Oh yeah, I hit you." And she also said that she threw pots and pans in self-defense. What the judge has essentially said here is that these tapes were made out of court and are therefore completely unreliable. He attributed no weight to them based on this reasoning. He decided to take Amber's testimony as the truth simply because it was made under oath. I'm reserving my personal opinions to the end of this video, but I really wanted to highlight how absolutely ridiculous this is to me as a member of the legal profession. Essentially, the judge is saying that when it comes to Amber, perjury is not even an option. Now, we all know that Amber likes to say that Johnny has an alter ego or a different side to him called the monster. He's like a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde character. Johnny's response to that was she made that entire thing up and that she referred to him as a monster simply when he disagreed with her during arguments. The judge did not accept that Amber made up that expression, and he essentially believed her when she said that Johnny, specifically when under the influence of drugs and alcohol, becomes a monster. Now, in criminal trials, evidence of good character is not a defense per se, but it is often used and the jury are instructed to consider it in favor of the defendant. This is a civil case and the judge was not bound by this ruling at all, but he decided to apply this in relation to Johnny and Amber's lack of a criminal history. He did make mention of Amber's 2009 arrest and stated that she took the appropriate steps to remove that from her record. And he also made mention that charges were never pursued. I have an entire video talking about why they were not pursued, which I'm not going to get into here. But essentially, it's not because she was found to be innocent. She was never exonerated. It was simply a lack of evidence and a jurisdictional issue as well. And he also made note of the fact that Tasia Van Ree came out and publicly supported Amber in 2016 with regards to that arrest. And so he decided to take all of this as good character evidence, I'm assuming for the both of them. But of course, it ended up only benefiting Amber because, as we all know, Johnny was found to be a wife beater. With regards to the infamous reality show video that was played out to Whitney Henriquez, Amber's sister, the judge decided that the film added nothing of value to the issue of whether Amber has a violent record. The judge also rejected the notion that evidence of Amber's short temper, as presented by mental health professionals, is not to be taken as an indication that she has the propensity to become violent, which is quite the opposite of what he decided with Johnny, which again, I will be talking about in more detail when I present my personal take on this judgment at the end of the video. Johnny presented text messages that he sent to Malcolm Connolly, his bodyguard, on the 5th of April 2016. The judge decided not to take this evidence into consideration because the 5th of April was not an incident amongst the 14 incidents that were included as part of this case. Specifically, he stated that Amber was not asked about these texts in her evidence. So without her having had the opportunity to comment on these texts, he considered that it would be unfair to both her and NGN to hold them against them. Which I have to say, again, strictly from a legal standpoint, if things are not put to the other side and they're not cross-examined on the issue, then it is unfair for the judge to make a determination on that issue because that side didn't have the opportunity to comment on it. And you will see that he renders the same decision to Johnny's benefit later down the line. One of the incidents that he has found to be unfounded was because it was not put to Johnny in cross-examination, and so Johnny didn't have the opportunity to address it. It's all about procedural fairness and ensuring that both parties are treated fairly. All right, now we get to the incidents, and this is the part of the judgment that is incredibly lengthy, very detailed. Judge Nichols goes through every single incident and essentially summarizes it and repeats the evidence. And it's all very repetitive. The judge basically, throughout the incident, states that Johnny was a monster, he hurt Amber. And that's kind of why I'm not going through them in detail. The judgment in its entirety will be linked in the description box. It will be the first link there. I will be summarizing this part, and I will only be pointing out key incidents in a little bit more detail. So there were 14 incidents in total, and the judge found that 12 out of 14 of those were true. So only 2 were found to be unfounded. Hey everyone, we're just going to briefly transition over to this voiceover format because initially I was going to gloss over incident 2 and incident 4, which is why I didn't film those portions, and I decided to add these later while I was editing. I want to mention a few things from incident 2, which is the painting incident. And again, I'd like to remind you all that I will not be going through the facts and the evidence unless it is pertinent to the judge's reasoning, so unless it's mentioned in his reasoning. The first thing I want to refer to is this photo. The judge assumed from this photo that Johnny was drinking whiskey on the 22nd of March 2013, the date of this incident. He also found that he was using cocaine, even though Johnny didn't admit to doing that, or rather didn't remember doing that. The judge assumed from the presence of the box that says property of JD. He based his assumptions on Amber and Whitney's testimony and from hearsay text messages sent by Amber to Johnny's sister and her mother. I'm pointing this out because the judge is clearly being selective when it comes to out-of-court evidence and the weight that is being attributed to them. He refused to attribute any weight to the audio recordings of Amber, and yet he attributes weight to text messages or any extraneous evidence that paints Johnny in a bad light. I also want to talk about these 2 photographs that were taken of Amber on set during March 2013. Now, the date of the first photograph, the group photo, is actually undetermined. It has no metadata. And so as a result, the judge was unable to use this photo as proof that Amber was not injured during the filming of this documentary, which began on the 21st of March 2013, and the date of this incident is the day after. As for the second photo, it is dated the 7th of April 2013, but Johnny's legal team surmised that it must have been taken on the 23rd of March 2013 because it was the only day that Ian McLagan was present on set, and this is the man who we can see here with Amber in the photo. Despite the disparity with the dates, the judge decided that the photo was not sufficiently clear enough for him to decide whether she appeared to be injured in the photo or not. I also want to point out that the judge accepted Amber and Whitney's explanations for how they got the dates mixed up and how they both merged two incidents into one. The second incident I want to talk about, and this is the final one before we go back to the video format, is Incident 4, which took place on the plane journey from Boston to LA. The judge used Johnny's text messages to Paul Bettany to determine, in addition, of course, to Amber's testimony, that Johnny was inebriated during this flight and had consumed substantial quantities of alcohol and also partook in cocaine. The judge assumed in the course of the flight that the verbal insults became physical abuse, and he discredited Stephen and Jerry Judge when they stated that it was just a playful tap. He did not accept that and stated that their first loyalty was to Johnny. All right, let's jump right back into the video. The judge found that it was Johnny who was throwing bottles, not Amber, and he believed her when she said she only threw the one. The judge also found that Johnny cut his own finger. He stated the exact methodology is unknown, but speculated that he accidentally cut his finger on broken glass. And any evidence where Johnny did say that he cut his own finger because he was covering for Amber was rejected by the judge. He found that Johnny was not covering for Amber. He was merely saying the truth, that he actually cut his own finger. Now, this is interesting to me because Amber never alleged that Johnny cut his own finger on glass. She always maintained that he hurt his finger smashing the plastic wall phone into smithereens. And so the judge essentially assumed this entire thing all on his own. With regards to the photograph of the cuts on Amber's left arm, the judge ruled that she did not self-harm, which is contrary to Jerry Judge's non-expert opinion. And so because Jerry was not an expert on such things, according to the judge, very little weight was attributed to Jerry's comments on the recording that the cuts were clearly self-inflicted. In support of his reasoning, the judge relied on the fact that Amber had no history of self-harming. With regards to the photo that was presented, it was taken years later, and so the judge found it was not helpful at all in determining whether the cuts were self-inflicted. And so he decided to rule that Amber accidentally cut herself on the glass. Now, she never said this. She said she was dragged through the glass during her fights with Johnny. And so this accidental cutting is yet another assumption that the judge arrived at all on his own. With regards to the cigarette burn, the judge found that Johnny most likely burnt himself with the cigarette, and he relied on the fact that there was no mention of such an injury in any of the medical records or even from notes made by Dr. Kipper. And the aspect of the judgment that I really take serious issue with can be found in this incident. The judge stated, "I accept her evidence of the nature of the assaults he committed against her. They must have been terrifying." They must have been terrifying is a personal opinion that was injected into this judgment by the judge. This is not out of the norm. I'm not going to say that judges are robots who don't have personal opinions that they inject throughout their judgment. But when I read it personally, I found it to be completely unnecessary. And if anything, it just really highlighted the bias that the judge had, the inherent belief that women can only be victims and that men are always the abusers. Now, there were allegations of a sexual nature that were made in private by Amber in relation to this incident, and these were accepted by the judge, but his reasoning is once again confined to the confidential annex to the judgment. In relation to the staircase incident, the infamous incident where Amber is filmed during her deposition explaining how she was protecting her baby sister, the judge found in her favor. He believed that Johnny was attacking both her and Whitney and that Amber punched him in defense of her sister. Now, the cast was mentioned in the judge's reasoning, but he never once paused to think about how implausible or painful it would have been for Johnny to hit these women with his injured arm. Because Whitney and Amber both did not mention any caste in their statements, and even in the deposition itself in 2016. But during their testimony, during their cross-examination, when it was put to them by Eleanor Laws, they stated that he hit them with the caste. So they didn't even bother saying, oh, he used his left hand because his right hand was out of service, really. And I found that to be a blow to NGN's defense, because it was an important factor to take into consideration. However, unfortunately, the judge completely ignored that factor. Another interesting aspect is the judge pointing out that Travis McGivern had inconsistent accounts in cross-examination and his statement. The judge found that to be troubling and impinged on Mr. McGivern's credibility. This, as I will discuss later, is in stark contrast to his determination of the evidence presented by Amber and her witnesses. For the incident of the 15th of December 2015, a day before the James Corden appearance, the judge found that Johnny was under the influence and assaulted Amber. The judge found that the headbutt was not accidental, as Johnny claimed in cross-examination. So he relied on the San Francisco recording where Johnny admits to headbutting Amber, but does not state that it was an accident. So despite not placing any weight on the audio recordings of Amber admitting to physically assaulting Johnny and telling him that she cannot promise that she will stop, Judge Nichols decided to do the exact opposite and placed a considerable amount of weight on the tapes where he can hear Johnny talking about the headbutt with no mention of it being an accident. The judge also accepted that Johnny ripped Amber's hair off. Now, it's interesting. He concedes that there is no expert evidence on the issue of how Johnny could have ripped it off without ripping it off from the root. As you'll remember, Eleanor Laws very aptly pointed out that the hair broke from the shafts mid-length, which is not really how hair is ripped out of someone's head. But in a very bewildering decision, the judge decided to buy Amber's story despite the lack of expert evidence. Another great point made by Johnny's team that was shot down by the judge was the fact that her lips are always very dry and they are prone to bleeding. The judge rejected this notion. He placed no significance on Nurse Erin's notes that Amber had no visible injuries. His reasoning being that it was a quick examination rather than a clinical one. With regards to the photo of Johnny's injuries sustained that night, the judge ruled that Amber did not cause them. And again, he arrives at this conclusion with no supporting evidence, with no factual basis whatsoever. He just says, in my opinion, in my judgment, Amber didn't cause these scratches. He never explains why she would have been incapable of doing so. He tries to discredit Mr. Bett by saying that he overestimated the length of the injury, but that has nothing to do with whether Amber caused it, no matter how long or short the injury may be. So I'm not going to go through the details of his reasoning with regards to the night of her 30th birthday, because what he says is she never hit him, he hit her, he came back very angry, and he took it out on her. With no basis, no factual evidence, nothing. But what I do want to talk about is the feces. He found it to be irrelevant. Irrelevant to the question of whether Johnny abused Amber, which I understand where he's coming from. Whether it's true or not, as he said in his judgment, it doesn't really have much bearing on whether Johnny physically assaulted her. What I take issue with, however, is him once again injecting his personal opinion with no factual basis in Amber's favor. He states that Amber and her friends, in his opinion, didn't do it. Johnny left that night and he spent the night at his West Hollywood property. So according to the judge, he wasn't even there in the penthouse to suffer from that discovery, which doesn't make sense to me because it could have been left in the morning right before they left to Coachella for Johnny to find, or even maybe for the housekeeper to find which is eventually what ended up happening. The judge further went on to say that it could have been Boo. Amber did say that Boo had problems with soiling, and Amber has stepped up and cleaned it all by herself without even asking Ms. Vargas to do it. So he was praising her essentially. And he completely disregarded the fact that the size of that thing could not have come out of such a tiny dog. All right, the final incident, the 21st of May, 2016. The judge accepted Amber's photos as proof of her injuries. He stated that the different lighting is what made each photo look a little bit different with the coloring and the saturation. He found Josh Drew to be an impressive and highly credible witness, which I find to be almost laughable, because that man is not only still currently very close friends with Amber. In fact, photos of him hiking with her only surfaced last week, if not a couple of weeks ago, but he never witnessed anything. I talked about his statement in a different video. I don't remember which one at this point, but his entire statement is based on hearsay. It's based on what Raquel told him, his ex-wife. But the judge decided to assign an incredible amount of credibility to him and used that reasoning to believe Josh when he said that the photos were not staged. But that's not even the worst of it. What I take serious issue with is the judge's decision to completely undermine the testimony of two police officers who were trained in the area of domestic violence. In fact, Officer Sains was a trainer. She trained other police officers in the area. And this is one of those parts of the judgment that I want to read out verbatim. It is notable that the officers took no contemporaneous notes. While it is not for me to criticize the methods of another police force, the absence of contemporaneous notes means that their evidence does not carry the same weight as it would otherwise. And with regards to the redness on Amber's face, he says, although she, Officer Sains, attributed this to misheard crying, an ambiguity remains. The judge essentially decided that the absence of written notes is enough to undermine their entire testimony, despite the fact that they directly witnessed it with their own eyes. They examined her face twice. And let's not forget, these are trained people. These aren't people like you and I who may see someone crying and their face is red, and we may not be qualified to determine whether that redness was caused by injury or from crying. And he still chose to completely disregard their evidence, which to me and to everyone out there was one of the strongest pieces of evidence that Johnny had against Amber. Instead, the evidence of Raquel Pennington and Josh Drew and Elizabeth Mars was deemed to be more reliable and credible. He proceeds to take Amber's word over that of more independent, impartial witnesses, being the Eastern Columbia building staff. He believed her when she said she was a celebrity and she would never be caught without even the slightest hint of makeup on. This is despite the fact that Mrs. Sparza very clearly stated that she was a woman and she knew exactly what a woman looks like without a hint of makeup on. In fact, she even complimented Amber on her skin and what she was using, and Amber just said a certain moisturizer. Now, of course, that can be explained away by the defense, and they could say that Amber only said that because she was embarrassed to tell Mrs. Sparza that she had makeup on and that she was actually covering an injury. But I am going to stress on the fact that as a woman myself, we can very clearly tell when someone has makeup on, especially when you're seeing them face to face, not through a camera, not through TV, not through an Instagram filter. The judge also found Mr. Alejandro Romero and Mr. Cornelius Harrell to be unreliable witnesses because they got the dates mixed up or they overestimated the amount of time that they spent talking to Amber face to face. The judge made a few generalized remarks towards the end of his judgment. Amongst these, he stated that no one challenged the notion that Amber never donated $7 million to charity, and so he used this donation as proof that she is not a gold digger, as Johnny has maintained throughout this case. There was never any evidence of this $7 million donation given. In fact, it is now a point of contention in the Virginia defamation trial. And the judge still decided to assume, without any factual basis, that the donation actually took place. And finally, the judge relied on this text message that Johnny sent Christian Carino as evidence of Johnny's feelings towards Amber. And I will put it up on the screen for you. If you want to read it, you can pause. First and foremost, I do want to mention that Johnny's assistant, Steven, posted this statement on Twitter. Essentially, it's a statement from Johnny's lawyers, Schillings, stating that the judgment was absolutely ridiculous and they will be appealing it. Now, with regards to the topic of appeals, I have been getting a lot of questions about whether Johnny can appeal. I did make a video on this right after the trial ended in anticipation of this because, of course, it was never a guaranteed win in my head and in your heads. If you have any questions with regards to the appeals process in the UK, please do watch that video. The only question that I cannot answer is whether he will be given leave to appeal. I talk about the conditions that must be met in that video, but in practice, whether his arguments are compelling enough to grant him permission, I have no idea. I have heard that the bar is very high to grant appeals in the UK, and so maybe he won't be granted one, but there is no way for me to determine it because it's actually a subjective determination that is up to the courts to decide in their own discretion. I also want to dispel this myth of judges being infallible. People, understandably so, view judges as really high-standing members of society who are very wise and very knowledgeable and can do no wrong. That is a myth. That is untrue. Judges are human and judges can get things wrong, and they do all the time, which is why the appeals process exists. My issue with this judgment is, as I said, it is almost entirely based on assumptions, not on facts. It is practically devoid of judicial reasoning. He assumed that Johnny was partaking in drugs and alcohol, and he assumed that as a direct result of this, Johnny became violent. There was no evidence provided whatsoever that Johnny becomes violent when he is under the influence. Why now? Why only with Amber? Johnny has had substance abuse problems for his entire life. He has had numerous partners throughout his life, and he has come across numerous people. And yet, not a single complaint of his tendency to become physically violent when under the influence has ever surfaced. Usually with these things, with the Me Too movement, when an allegation comes out against a person, numerous others tend to follow because these people tend to have a modus operandi. They have a way of doing things. Drug use and memory lapses and blackouts do not automatically equate to resorting to physical violence. The judge decided to rule that Amber's quick temper does not automatically mean she was physically violent, and yet he decided to rule the exact opposite with regards to Johnny. He mentioned destruction of property throughout his judgment as well as proof that Johnny resorts to violence against human beings. That is another dangerous assumption that I am quite very frankly surprised a 60-something-year-old judge, in all his wisdom, decided to make. Johnny, the kitchen cupboard beater, does not mean that he is also Johnny, the wife beater. If Amber was afraid of him, she wouldn't have laughed at the end of that video when he was actually being violent towards inanimate objects. She would have been cowering. She would have been scared. She wouldn't have followed him out, which it looks like she was. Despite that distinction being pointed out to Judge Nichols, he still decided to base his assumptions that Johnny was violent on the fact that he destroyed inanimate objects. He assumed that Amber did not self-harm. He assumed that Johnny ripped off her hair despite the lack of expert evidence. In a nutshell, I would describe this judgment as an assumption, and a very dangerous one at that. The double standard displayed throughout this judgment was painfully obvious. Judge Nichols made mention of the fact that witness testimony is sworn under oath to be the truth and nothing but the truth. And he held Amber to that standard. However, Johnny and his witnesses have also provided evidence under oath. Why was the same reasoning not applied to them? The credibility of Amber's witnesses was never called into question, despite the fact that they themselves were quite inconsistent and clearly were loyal to Amber. The most obvious one being her own sister. On the other hand, all of Johnny's witnesses were described as enthusiastic supporters, as enablers of Johnny. He saw them as yes people, as people who were terrified of him because they were loyal to him as their employer and depended on him for their livelihood. And so they were prepared to do anything for him, including stand by and watch as he physically assaulted his wife. That is a very dangerous assumption to make. And it is an insult to the character of each and every one of these witnesses, especially the men. These men were specifically asked, would you have just stood by and let a man beat his wife? And they said no. By undermining that testimony and stating that they were unreliable and biased, Judge Nichols implied that they supported a wife beater. As I mentioned before, hearsay evidence that was detrimental to Amber was entirely disregarded. But any out-of-court statements in the form of text messages or recordings that were detrimental to Johnny were attributed significant weight. It's come to my attention that a lot of people have uncovered that Judge Nichols may have had a conflict of interest in this case. He co-authored a book some time ago now, and the co-author is the ex-husband of a woman who is friends with Amber and who apparently invited Amber over to a party during the trial proceedings. Judge Nichols is also said to have ties to Jen Robinson, who was one of Amber's lawyers. Personally, I don't want to speculate. I don't have enough information to determine whether Judge Nichols did have a sufficient relationship with Jennifer Robinson to justify a recusal. A recusal is when a judge excuses themselves from a case because of a possible or identified conflict of interest. It can be self-initiated or it can be instigated at the request of one of the parties. I found a helpful document on the judiciary website in the UK called the Guide to Judicial Conduct, and it does directly address issues of conflicts of interest. Page 21 of the document deals with personal relationships and perceived bias, and it goes on to list situations where a judge should potentially recuse themselves from a case because of a relationship that they may have with one of the involved parties or because of an interest that they may have. This document also deals with how judges should behave and how they should treat a potential conflict of interest, which I essentially just explained. If a potential conflict of interest is found to exist or potentially arise, then they can recuse themselves or at the least inform the parties of this discovery and go from there. Another point I want to mention before closing this video is the inherent risks that can come with litigation. I am certain that Johnny's lawyers warned him of this happening, so he was aware that this was a potential outcome. Some lawyers have come out and said that Johnny should have just released a public statement denying all of Amber's allegations and then moving forward with his life. But who are we to judge? Who are we to decide that that is the right course of action? Johnny felt, and I believe still continues to feel, that he has made the right decision in pursuing this case. It is his way of declaring to the world that he finds her allegations outrageous and worth fighting for on such a public scale and risking so much. And others, of course, can argue that this was not a risk, and despite this loss, Johnny has done what he set out to do, which is get his truth out, get the evidence out there, which may not have happened if he didn't initiate these proceedings. And so despite this verdict, Johnny has secured the love and support of millions of people worldwide. Because let's not forget that the judgment of one judge should not be enough to completely undermine the truth. We are all human beings, as Judge Nichols is. We all have eyes, we all have brains. I'd like to think that most of us are very capable of using all of these faculties in order to arrive at our own decisions. Judges are not gods. Their words are not gospel. I have to stress that my support of Johnny is entirely based on the strength of his evidence, not on the fact that he is Johnny Depp. And I've said this before, and I'm sure most of you, if not all of you, feel the same way. As for the question of whether this will affect the Virginia trial, I also have a video entirely responding to that question. It is purely based on my professional opinion. It is not the right opinion by any means. So it's going to be linked down below if you haven't seen it already. And if you've seen it, then you know what my opinion is. I do want to end this video on a high note, if it's even possible. The silver lining arising out of this case is that Amber now has her evidence recorded in the form of transcripts as part of a judicial proceeding. This means that she is now essentially bound by that evidence, and if she changes it, it will be brought up by Johnny's lawyers as prior inconsistent statements in order to completely undermine her credibility. That's it for this video. I know it was a very long one, and I know that it was not a particularly happy one. We did not want this outcome, but this is the way things work. You can never predict the outcome of such cases. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching. Stay safe, stay positive, and I will catch you in a future video.